It started at the dining table of all places: white linen, stemmed glasses, polite chatter, and the low hum of a playlist that tried too hard to sound effortless. I remember the scent of rosemary chicken, the shine of polished cutlery, and how the late spring sunlight filtered through the curtains, slicing the room into golden geometry. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Or maybe he was, but I hadn't expected his presence to shake me like that. My friend had mentioned her brother would be passing through town and might drop by briefly. "He's quieter now," she'd said in passing, pouring us both Chardonnay. "Since the divorce, I mean. Less charming, more human. But he wasn't quieter. He wasn't anything less. He was just distilled." The years had stripped him of the boyish arrogance I remembered, leaving a slower, weightier kind of presence. He didn't need to say much. He sat down at the far end of the table, said hello, and the entire atmosphere shifted like the temperature had risen 3 degrees. He looked at me like people don't usually do anymore. Not with hunger, not with flirtation, with recognition. As though he knew something about me I'd forgotten myself. My husband, meanwhile, sat next to me, shoulder grazing mine every so often, murmuring updates about the yard work or asking if I'd seen his phone charger. He was warm, considerate, exactly as he always is. I can't say I'm unhappy. Not on the surface. We have a rhythm, tidy, reliable, almost melodic. But in that moment, hearing his voice run parallel to the silent gaze of the man across the table, I felt something tighten in my chest, like a thread being pulled from the center of me. I should say this clearly. Nothing happened. Not that day, not even a gesture. But I left the house feeling cracked open in a way that frightened me. I looked in the rearview mirror of our car as my husband drove us home and caught my own eyes. Wide, unreadable. That night, I changed into my usual cotton sleepwear, folded neatly in the drawer beside his. I lay beside him in bed, our backs close, but not touching. He kissed my shoulder lightly, without waiting for a response. I stared into the darkness, aware of every cell in my skin. What unnerved me wasn't desire. It was being seen. For the first time in years, someone had looked at me and not seen his wife, or their friend, or that woman from accounting. He saw something in me still burning. 2 days later, my friend invited us again. "Just something casual," she said. "Come by, relax, he might be there again." I asked what he was up to these days, pretending not to care, and she waved vaguely. "Still figuring things out, I think. You know how men are after a breakup, existential." I laughed along, but inside I wasn't laughing. Inside, I was already wondering what I'd wear, not in a seductive way. In a way that made me feel alert, aware. As if choosing between a silk blouse or a soft linen shirt could somehow calibrate how visible I allowed myself to be. I chose the silk, pale green. Simple, but with a looseness around the neckline that I hadn't worn in years. My husband noticed, of course. He said I looked beautiful, like always. But like always was exactly the problem. When we arrived, he was already there. Sitting in the garden, a cup of tea beside him, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He stood to greet us, and when he hugged my friend, his eyes flicked briefly to mine, like punctuation at the end of a silent sentence. Later, when the others were inside, clearing plates or refilling glasses, I walked out onto the patio where he stood alone. He said nothing at first, just handed me a glass of water. We looked out at the trees together. "I barely recognized you the other night," he said finally, his voice low. "But then you laughed, and it hit me." "What?" I asked, but I already knew. He didn't answer, just looked down at his hands, then at me. And then someone called us from inside. I followed him back in like nothing had shifted, but everything had. I could feel it in the way my feet touched the floor, in the way I said thank you too quickly, in the way my skin seemed to pulse beneath the silk of my shirt, and I knew. This wasn't about cheating. Not yet. This was about remembering who I used to be before I became someone else's reliable woman, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely gone. It wasn't premeditated, not in the way people might think. I didn't wake up planning to wear the dress that clung slightly more than necessary, or to pick out the perfume that had been sitting at the back of my vanity for 2 years, the one that felt too heady for grocery runs or work meetings. It just happened. My hand reached for it like it had a mind of its own. A quiet rebellion, one atom at a time. The occasion was small, a 2-day retreat at a converted farmhouse my friend's husband had rented for a corporate offsite. She invited me along as a last-minute addition. "Honestly, come just to get out of the city," she said breezily. "There'll be too many men in golf shirts otherwise. I need backup." My husband had an engineering conference that weekend. He was more relieved than disappointed when I said I'd be gone. He even joked, "You deserve time off from me." That wasn't the problem. I wasn't running from him. I was running from the me who had become so seamlessly invisible beside him. The drive was long and flat, fields stitched together like patched linen, occasional cows standing like statues against the wind. I played music softly, unfamiliar songs, letting them flood the silence. When I arrived, the house stood like something out of an interior design catalog: whitewashed brick, tall windows, the faint scent of wood smoke threading through the breeze. Inside, everyone was already milling around, half drunk on wine and fresh air. He was there, not surprised to see me, not awkward, just present. And for some reason, that composure made it harder. Had he thought of me since last time? Had I even crossed his mind? That evening, after dinner, most of the group wandered out to the fire pit. The light from the flames flickered across glassware and linen shirts, laughter curling upward with the smoke. I felt restless, the kind of restlessness that presses against the walls of your ribs and demands movement. I slipped back toward the house, toward quiet, toward breath. I didn't know he had done the same. We met in the kitchen, half lit, the hum of the refrigerator, louder than it should have been. He stood by the sink, sleeves once again rolled up. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, the way certain chords hold a room in suspension before resolving. He held out a glass of water, and I took it. Our fingers touched, not an accident, not deliberate either, something in between. We stood that way for a while, just breathing in the same air. I should have left. I should have said something banal about the food, the night, the wine. But I didn't. Instead, I asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like you forgot something about yourself?" He didn't blink, just looked at me like he'd expected the question. "All the time," he said. There was no music, no script, no build-up. He stepped closer, carefully, without assumption. I felt his hand graze my wrist. My skin flinched, not in fear, but in unfamiliar recognition. He leaned in, and I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The kiss wasn't deep. It wasn't wild. It was quiet. A press of mouths that felt more like acknowledgement than hunger. As though he were asking, "Is it still you?" And I was answering, "Yes." I stepped back first. Not from panic, but from weight. The kind of weight that falls on your shoulders when you realize a threshold has been crossed and you cannot walk back through it. "I shouldn't have," I began. He shook his head, not to dismiss, but to absolve. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. But I had. Not in action, but in origin. In desire. In the way I had craved not him, specifically, but being wanted at all. I left the kitchen and returned to the others, sliding into a half-empty chair as if I hadn't been, somewhere else just seconds before. My friend glanced at me and smiled, holding out a marshmallow on a stick. I took it with numb fingers. That night, alone in my room, I lay awake in a bed too clean to feel real. The sheets rustled every time I moved, as though they were keeping score. I thought of my husband, not with guilt, but with sadness. He loved me, truly. But I couldn't remember the last time he had made me feel present. The next morning, I found myself folding my clothes more precisely than usual, as if the order could iron out what I felt inside. My friend chatted beside me, oblivious. I asked her, casually, carefully, how often she saw her brother. "Not that often," she said. "He's got his own ghosts to wrestle." Ghosts, that was the word. As we packed up to leave, he walked past me once outside, brushing his fingers lightly against the fabric of my coat. It was brief, innocent to anyone watching, but my skin felt branded. I didn't tell my husband when I got home. I didn't tell him anything at all. I just crawled into bed beside him that night, watched his chest rise and fall, and thought about how strange it was to feel so far away when we were only inches apart. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a reminder. And reminders are dangerous things. I avoided mirrors for 2 days after I got back. There was something unsettling about catching my own reflection now, as if I'd look and not see a woman, but a question with no clean answer. I went through the motions. Laundry, invoices, dinner prep, polite laughter at something my husband said about his colleague's new boat. But I moved like a person watching herself from outside her own body. Everything I did felt like a reenactment of a life I used to live sincerely. He didn't write, he didn't call. Not that I expected him to. But I caught myself checking my phone for no reason, as if a message might appear without being sent. That quiet tension, the one that settles behind your ribs and makes it hard to sit still, started to build. I folded towels with too much precision, rearranged bookshelves that didn't need it, avoidance masquerading as order. It wasn't desire that lingered. It was the way the kiss had left me feeling real. For a moment, I'd stopped being a role and had simply existed, as a body, a mind, a person seen. That was the part I couldn't. Seemed to silence. The third morning back, my friend called. Her voice was chipper, filled with plans and errands and casual updates. Somewhere between the discussion about school fundraisers and new throw pillows, she said it. Oh, by the way, could you swing by my place tomorrow afternoon? I need someone to check on the plumber while I run to the store. My brother's supposed to be dropping something off anyway, so you won't be alone. She said it like it was nothing. Like it was logistics. I said yes. The lie was immediate and reflexive. I told my husband I had a work errand, something about documents and signatures. He barely looked up from his laptop. Don't forget to pick up more coffee, he said, and kissed the air near my cheek as I grabbed my keys. When I arrived at her house, it was exactly as I remembered, bright, warm, filled with plants and the faint scent of lemon-scented cleaning spray. She was halfway out the door, tossing casual instructions over her shoulder. He might be a little late, knowing him, she said with a laugh. You know how men are with clocks. The door closed behind her, and silence settled like a blanket. Wandered through the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with the framed family photos, and poured myself a glass of water just to give my hands something to do. I wasn't sure what I expected. That he wouldn't come, that I'd leave before he arrived, that this would somehow remain harmless. I didn't expect to hear the door click open only 20 minutes later. He stepped in like he lived there, keys in one hand, a reusable shopping bag in the other. He froze when he saw me, but only for a moment. She didn't mention you'd be here, he said, not coldly, just evenly. She didn't mention you either, I replied. He dropped the bag gently onto the kitchen counter. Did you think about it? He asked without turning around. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. I nodded. He turned then, slowly, his gaze scanning me like he wasn't looking at me but into me. That silence returned, the same one from the kitchen, during the retreat, the one thick with unspoken things. We stood that way too long, both of us knowing we should speak, should change the subject, should walk away. Neither of us moved. Finally, he stepped forward, carefully, like approaching a wild animal you don't want to startle. His hand brushed mine, not by mistake, and I didn't pull away. My breath caught. My fingers closed around his like they'd been waiting. I don't want to hurt you, he said. You won't, I lied. He kissed me again. This time there was no ambiguity. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't curiosity. It was an answer to a question we'd both been avoiding. The kiss was firmer, slower, his hands finding my waist with the confidence of someone not asking permission, but offering intention. I felt the heat bloom through my chest and down into my legs, grounding me like gravity. For a few suspended seconds, there was no marriage, no loyalty, no consequence, just sensation. I broke away first, not because I didn't want it, because I wanted it too much. He didn't speak, just stood there, breathing hard, watching me like I might disappear. I have to go, I said, voice trembling. He stepped aside, not stopping me, but not stepping back either. As I passed, his fingers grazed my wrist one last time. The drive home was blurrier than it should have been. I don't remember the roads. I don't remember the lights. I remember only the weight between my ribs and the ache that came from being touched like that. Not with lust, with recognition. When I walked through the door, my husband was finishing a phone call. He smiled at me. Did you get everything? Done. I nodded, setting my bag down carefully as if it might break. He came over and kissed my forehead gently. You look tired. I said nothing, because how could I explain that I wasn't tired? I was alive, terrifyingly, exhilaratingly, alive, and I didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, the sun came in too strong through the kitchen windows, slicing sharp golden beams across the countertop, hitting the handle of the coffee pot like a spotlight. I stood barefoot in my robe, watching the coffee drip slowly, too, slowly, as though the world had conspired to stretch time just when I needed it to pass. My husband was already in the shower. I could hear the water through the thin wall, a steady rhythm, comforting in its normalcy. He sang sometimes in the mornings, quietly, almost under his breath, but not today. The house was still. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt disoriented. The floor under my feet wasn't unfamiliar. The kitchen hadn't changed overnight, but I had. Or rather, something in me had been peeled back, and now everything ordinary stung a little. The smell of toast, the light scraping of a chair on tile, the hum of the refrigerator, everything was louder, more vivid, too present. That afternoon, he surprised me. I had just come back from the grocery store, a mild headache building behind my temples, when I saw the envelope on the table. No name, no flourish, just a cream rectangle propped beside a vase of wilting tulips. I opened it with the usual numbness, expecting an appointment reminder, a bill, but it was a reservation. 3 nights at a small inn near the coast. Romantic, sweet, dinner included, check-in Friday. I stared at the paper for a full minute before I sat down. He came in from the yard moments later, wiping his hands on an old rag. I thought we needed it, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It's been a long time since we did anything, just us. He wasn't wrong, he wasn't late, he was just misaligned. I smiled, automatic. Told him it was a lovely idea. Asked what made him think of it. He said he'd been watching me lately, noticed I seemed tired, withdrawn. He thought maybe I needed a change of scenery. I wanted to scream. Not because I was angry, but because he noticed, and it was somehow worse than if he hadn't. It meant he was watching, just not the way I wanted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily, counting rotations like I could slow the spiral inside me. His hand rested lightly on my hip beneath the sheet, a familiar weight, a comfort, a tether, but not a spark. The next evening, I packed deliberately. Nothing too bold, nothing that could be mistaken for performance. But I tucked one set of silk underwear deep into the corner of the bag, green, like the blouse I'd worn that day I saw him again. It wasn't about seduction. It was about identity, about remembering who I was, even if no one else ever saw it. The drive to the inn was quiet. He held my hand at red lights, smiled when we passed places we'd visited years ago. We checked in, were shown to a room with wide windows and a view of the gray sea stretching flat and endless into the distance. It smelled faintly of lavender and dusted wood, like something from another life. Dinner was lovely, the wine soft, the candles flickering between us. He talked about work, a new project, a colleague's promotion. I nodded in the right places. I asked questions. I laughed. But I wasn't really there. My mind kept pulling backward and forward in time like an elastic band, snapping between now and then, between this table and that kitchen. Later, in the room, he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or clumsy. It was slow, familiar. A man trying to reclaim something he sensed he had lost but couldn't name. His hands on my waist, his mouth at my collarbone, the sheet cool beneath my back. I tried to respond, to fold myself into the rhythm I'd once known, but I couldn't unsee the difference. I couldn't forget the weight of the other touch, the way it had unraveled something deep under my skin. My body went through the motions, but my mind drifted. Not to images of betrayal, not even to fantasy, to silence, to absence. I felt the absence of hunger, of ache, of that essential tremble that made intimacy feel like surrender rather than obligation. When it was over, he kissed. My forehead wrapped himself around me, whispered, "You okay?" against my shoulder. I didn't answer. I lay very still and waited for sleep to come, though I knew it wouldn't. The next day we walked along the beach, wind sharp, sea gray, and endless. He held my hand, pointed out strange shells, laughed when I shivered and buried my face in his scarf. It should have been enough. It would have been once. I watched him from the side sometimes, his profile against the wind, the lines at the corners of his mouth, the crease above his brow when he thought too hard. He was good, steady. He loved me, but I had started craving something else. Not danger. Not chaos. Recognition. That evening, alone in the bathroom, I ran my fingers over my stomach, watched my own expression in the mirror. The silk robe he'd brought me years ago was tied at the waist. Beneath it, the green lingerie pressed close to my skin. I didn't wear it for him. I wore it to see if I still knew what it felt like to be chosen. That night, I dreamed of a quiet room and someone looking at me like I was a secret worth keeping. I didn't tell him. I just kissed him back when he kissed me and pretended my eyes weren't open in the dark. We returned from the coast on a Sunday. Afternoon, the sky a dull smear of silver, threatening rain but never delivering it. The highway home was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels suspended, not peace but pause. My husband drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting casually near the gear shift, where my hand used to find his without thinking. I kept mine in my lap. He was humming again. A tune I didn't recognize, low and tuneless. I stared, out the window, watching trees and signage blur past, and thought about how long a person could sit next to someone before their silence became invisible. When we pulled into our driveway, he reached for my bag without asking. I followed him inside like a guest in my own life. Everything was familiar, the scent of our home, the coolness of the tile underfoot, the gentle whir of the ceiling fan. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping back into a performance. I no longer remembered how to give sincerely. That night, he cooked dinner, pasta with a sauce he knew I liked. We talked about bills, the next holiday, whether or not we should repaint the guest room. I listened, I agreed, I smiled, and when he touched my arm lightly, I didn't flinch. But I didn't lean in either. It was the following Tuesday when my friend texted me, something about dropping off a cake she'd baked, then an offhand line. By the way, he might swing by. I forgot he left some of his stuff here. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before responding with a simple thumbs-up emoji, as if that distanced me from the weight of the words. My husband had plans that evening, some after hours, meeting about infrastructure delays. He asked if I'd be okay alone. I said yes, too quickly. He didn't seem to notice. I wore jeans and a fitted sweater. Nothing suggestive, nothing obvious. But beneath it, I chose the silk again. Darker this time, less about seduction, more about reclaiming the feeling of being sharply, quietly alive. I put on perfume with a scent just slightly heavier than my usual, something with amber and pepper, something that clung to the wrists long after the bottle had been put away. When I arrived at her house, she was getting ready to leave. She kissed my cheek, thanked me for stopping by, made a joke about, her husband not knowing the difference between almond flour and plaster dust. Her brother hadn't arrived yet. "He'll be quick, I'm sure," she said. "In and out." But he wasn't quick. He wasn't rushed. He arrived just as I was wiping down the kitchen counter, the last rays of sun casting long shadows across the tile. He stepped inside like he belonged there, like he'd never left. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then finally he spoke. "Weren't expecting me so soon, were you?" His voice was quieter than I remembered. Or maybe everything else was just louder. My pulse, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my breath catching behind my ribs. "I knew you'd come," I said. And I did. Not factually, but something in me had known, had hoped. He stepped closer, slowly, like approaching something fragile. "You look different." "I feel different." I didn't mean to say it, but it slipped out, like something long trapped beneath my ribs had finally broken through. "I can't stop thinking about that night," he said, his gaze not leaving mine. Neither could I. The pause between us wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of questions, of the weight of everything unsaid. Then he reached for me. The second kiss was nothing like the first. The first had been tentative, laced with hesitation, an echo of a thought neither of us wanted to finish. This one was deliberate, measured. He touched my face like he'd done it before in a dream and wanted to get it right now that it was real. His mouth met mine, not with hunger, but with insistence. An insistence that this was real, that we were not imagining it, that there was a pulse between us we couldn't ignore anymore. My hands found his shirt, curling into the fabric, grounding myself in the solidity of it. His fingers slid along my waist, not possessively, but reverently, like tracing a line that had been long forgotten. I felt the heat of him even through the layers of my clothing, and beneath it all, the silk clung to my skin, a silent witness to what I had become. When we broke apart, breathless, there was no apology in the air. No panic, just silence, deep and heavy, like the space between ocean waves. He looked at me, brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I don't feel guilty. Does that make me awful?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We sat together, for a while, not speaking. The lights in the house began to dim with the sunset, and outside, the street remained quiet. Inside, the tension between us had shifted. It was no longer if, it was when. Eventually, I stood to leave. He didn't try to stop me. I paused in the doorway, looking back at him once, anchoring the moment in memory. His posture, his eyes, the way he seemed both certain and unsure all at once. When I got home, the house was empty. My husband's bag still by the door, his keys on the hook. I went upstairs, undressed slowly, folded the silk carefully, and placed it back where it belonged. In bed, I turned off the lamp and lay awake in the dark, listening for sounds that didn't come. Not the guilt, not the regret, just the distant echo of a door that had been opened and could never be closed again. The days that followed weren't marked by any dramatic shift, no cinematic unraveling, no stolen glances across crowded rooms or trembling hands brushing in the dark. Instead, life slipped back into its usual rhythm with a quiet that unnerved me more than chaos ever could. My husband didn't change. He still asked how I slept, still brought me coffee in the morning, still rested his hand on my lower back when we passed in the hallway. His love hadn't faded, but I had begun to notice the texture of it, soft, worn, comfortable to the point of invisibility, like a favorite shirt that still fits but no longer excites. He loved me the way one loves, a habit, gently, thoroughly, without hunger. At night, I lay beside him and pretended the silence between us was just sleep. But sleep didn't come easily anymore. I found myself drifting into strange dreams, some vivid, others disjointed, but all sharing the same haunting thread. Touch, not erotic, not frantic, just presence. A hand brushing against mine in a dark hallway. Fingers lacing together under a table. A weight beside me in bed that wasn't supposed to be there, but somehow felt right. I began to answer texts slower, speak softer, move more carefully through the house like I might trigger something, by accident. He noticed, in his way. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening while we loaded the dishwasher. I smiled and blamed it on work. He nodded and didn't press. That same night, when I thought he was asleep, I sat in the bathroom with the lights off, the glow from the hallway faint against the tile. I looked at myself in the mirror, not out of vanity, but out of need. The need to see whether anything had physically changed. There was no mark, no trace. And yet everything in me felt branded. I traced the line of my collarbone with my fingertips and thought of how he had done the same, not my husband, but the man who wasn't supposed to be anything. The next afternoon, I received a message from him. Nothing poetic, nothing bold. Just, I'll be at the bookstore near the park. Thought I'd mention it. No pressure. The simplicity of it made it harder to resist. Not because it was tempting, but because it wasn't. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just leaving a door unlocked. I told my husband I needed a few hours to run errands. He asked if I wanted him to come. I shook my head, kissed his cheek, and promised I wouldn't be long. It was raining when I arrived, the kind of light drizzle that slicks the streets but never quite breaks into a full storm. I spotted him through the window, seated near the back of the shop, flipping through a paperback with a torn cover. He looked up as I entered, but didn't stand. He simply nodded at the chair across from him, like we were old friends who did this often. We didn't speak right away. The sound of rain on the glass filled the space between us. I picked up a book from the display and opened it, pretending to read while my heart pounded. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said eventually. I wasn't either. He watched me. Not in the way men sometimes do, not searching for approval or clues, but measuring, like trying to determine how much of me still existed under the version the world saw. I keep thinking about your hands, he said, the way they trembled before you kissed me. They weren't trembling, I said too quickly. He raised an eyebrow. No, I hesitated. Maybe not from fear. He smiled at that, gently, not triumphantly. There was no game here, no chasing. Only recognition. We didn't touch that afternoon. We didn't need to. The air between us held more contact than skin ever could. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't ask when we'd see each other again. He simply said, "Take care of yourself." And I nodded, because I didn't know how to say, "I don't know who that is" anymore. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I thought I might. Instead, I felt hollowed out. Like something essential had been scooped from me, and I was now walking around in a body that moved the same, but felt entirely different inside. At dinner, my husband poured me wine, asked if I'd found everything I needed at the store. I nodded, and said the lines I always said. But when he reached across the table and brushed a stray hair from my face, I didn't feel warm. I felt observed. Later that night, I initiated something physical. I don't know why. Maybe to test myself. Maybe to blur the lines. Maybe because I wanted to believe I was still anchored to the life I'd built. He responded eagerly, gratefully, like he'd been waiting for a sign. But the entire time, I watched the ceiling, counted the spaces between breaths, and felt my body move while my mind floated elsewhere. Afterwards, he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "I missed this. I missed you." I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to hide the truth that pressed against my chest like a bruise. He hadn't missed me. He'd missed who I used to be, and I didn't know how to tell him she wasn't coming back. Somewhere between that night and the end of the week, the air between us began to solidify into something I couldn't quite name. My husband became more attentive in small, well-meaning ways, a hand on my lower back when we crossed the street, a suggestion to take a long weekend just the two of us, a box of my favorite tea that he placed wordlessly on the kitchen counter. He didn't say the words I know, and I don't think he did, but there was a change in him, as if he'd finally noticed I was fading. I tried to match his effort. I cooked more often, touched his arm when he spoke, listened carefully to the stories from his office that I usually tuned out. I told myself this was repair work. I told myself I was choosing us again, but each time I tried to build the bridge back, my thoughts drifted, uninvited, unwanted, but insistent. I thought of the bookstore, of the rain streaking the glass, of the quiet way he'd looked at me, like someone memorizing a painting they knew they couldn't keep. I thought of how he didn't ask for more, didn't demand promises, didn't try to define what we were. He simply let me be, unfiltered, unfinished, unclaimed. And then, late Thursday evening, the conversation happened. We were sitting on the couch, the television muttering in the background, both of us half watching a documentary we wouldn't remember. He shifted slightly, rested his hand on my leg, and turned to me with a seriousness that pulled the breath from my lungs before he even spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice careful. "Maybe we should talk about having a child." I didn't answer. My mouth opened, then closed again. My chest tightened, not in fear, but in a sudden, jarring understanding of just how wide the gap between us had grown. He continued, not noticing the change in my expression. "I mean, we've built so much together. Maybe it's time. It's not about fixing anything. I just think we'd be good at it. You'd be incredible." That word hit me like a foreign object. Incredible. "What?" he saw in me now was still tethered to potential. What someone else had seen was already real. I stood without realizing I was going to. Mumbled something about needing air. He asked if I was okay. I nodded too quickly. He didn't follow me outside. The night was cold, the kind of cold that doesn't bite but numbs. I stood on the back patio in my slippers, arms crossed, staring at the dark outline of our neighbor's tree. It was bare now, branches skeletal against the orange haze of distant streetlights. I couldn't stop trembling. A child. The idea had never been entirely off the table. We'd talked about it over the years, always in passing, always with the safety net of later. But now it felt like a lock clicking into place. Not because he wanted to trap me, but because he believed this was the next step forward. As though we were still on the same path. But we weren't. We hadn't been for months. Maybe longer. Went back inside, climbed into bed next to him without a word, and lay awake until I could hear his breathing deepen into sleep. In the morning, I left earlier than usual under the pretense of work. I drove without a destination, circling familiar streets, hands cold on the wheel, until I found myself parked in front of a small cafe we used to frequent when we were first married. I sat there for a long time, watching people pass by, couples talking, laughing, checking phones. The world kept moving. I sent a message before I could stop myself. "Are you around today?" The reply came quicker than I expected. "Yes. You okay?" I didn't answer that part. I asked if he could meet me, somewhere quiet, somewhere neither of us would be recognized. An hour later, we sat in his car by the edge of the park, parked in a row of forgotten vehicles with fogged windows. The radio was off. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the windshield. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't reach for me. "I don't want a child," I said quietly. He turned slightly. "I didn't think you did." There was no judgment in his voice, only knowledge. I told him I'd think about it, I whispered. "But I already know. I'm not who he thinks I am anymore." He was silent for a moment, then softly, "You don't have to explain it to me." I looked at him, studied the shape of his face and profile, the way the light touched the edges of his jaw. There was something unbearably kind in how he just sat there, not trying to save me, not trying to lead me anywhere, just being with me in it. "I wish I met you sooner," I said. He turned to me then, and for the first time his expression cracked open just slightly. "Don't," he said. "We met now. That's all that matters." When he kissed me, it was unlike the times before. There was no urgency, no restraint. It was an answer to every question I hadn't dared ask. It was soft and slow and aching. It tasted like grief and clarity and the sharp edge of inevitability. When I pulled back, I didn't apologize. Neither did he. We sat there for a while, the air between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. Eventually, I rested my head on his shoulder, closed my eyes, and let the quiet take over. Because there, in that moment, nothing needed fixing. It just needed to be felt. There's a particular kind of silence that follows confession. Not the dramatic kind, not the silence that begs for a reaction, but the kind that settles slowly, like dust in a sunlit room. That's what the days felt like after I told him I didn't want a child, a stillness that no one dared name aloud. My husband didn't bring it up again. He moved through the week with an unusual softness, as if afraid to step too heavily in. Case he shattered something already cracked. He brought home takeout on a Tuesday night, remembered I preferred jasmine rice over white. He folded laundry before I got to it. He kissed my forehead each night like punctuation, a gentle reminder that we were still here, still functioning, and I played along. I laughed when expected, filled pauses with nods and small observations. I let him touch me without resistance, though something in my body had started to echo hollow when he did. I wondered if he noticed the vacancy behind my eyes, the way I sometimes stared past him rather than at him, but he never said a word. That weekend, he suggested we go away again, this time to the mountains, a cabin someone at work had offered. We could disconnect, he said. Get out of the city. No phones, just us. The idea should have frightened me. It should have felt like confinement, but instead it struck me as final. Like the last gasp of something that knew it was fading. I said yes. I packed light, comfortable sweaters, walking shoes, 2 books I knew I wouldn't open, and buried between them a thin lace slip I hadn't worn since before the last New Year's. I didn't know why I packed it. I wasn't even sure for whom. The cabin was beautiful in its simplicity. Wooden beams, the faint smell of pine, a fireplace that flickered even during the day. He was happy there. I could see it in the way he moved, slower, less tethered to devices and routine. He made breakfast with soft music playing, poured coffee into mismatched mugs, commented on the way the fog settled over the trees like a secret. I stood at the window for long stretches, watching the world blur into grayscale. The silence here was different, not tense, just vast. That first night, we drank wine beside the fire. He talked about building something, maybe a shed, maybe a new part of the deck. I smiled and let the sound of his voice fill the space between us. When he kissed me, I didn't stop him. When he touched me, I didn't pull away. I tried, for a while, to be fully present, but my mind wandered, to a pair of eyes that held questions without pressure, to a hand that had once rested on my leg like it knew what trembling lived beneath the surface. I thought of the car by the park, the warmth of lips that didn't ask for anything, only offered. And as my husband moved beside me with familiarity and care, I imagined what it would feel like to cry mid-embrace and not have to explain why. The next morning, I woke early, slipped out of bed and pulled on a sweater over bare skin. The chill in the air made my arms prickle. I stepped outside and sat on the cold porch steps, letting the silence of the woods hold me. I didn't feel guilt. I felt lost. Not in morality, but in identity. I had always been someone's something: daughter, wife, friend, reliable one. And now I was straddling two lives. In one, I was loyal and whole. In the other, I was raw and unfinished, but awake. I didn't hear him step outside, but I felt his presence behind me. "You always wake this early?" he asked, sitting beside me. "Only when I can't sleep." He nodded. "I worry sometimes," he said quietly, "that you're slipping away from me." The words hit with no force, like leaves falling. I didn't flinch. I didn't deny it. "You're here," he added. "But you're somewhere else too. I can feel it." I looked at him then, not with anger, not even sadness, just honesty. "I don't know where I am," I whispered. He didn't reach for me, didn't try to fix it. He just said, "I want you to find your way back." Later that day, I wandered into town while he napped, said I needed to stretch my legs. The truth sat beneath my coat pocket, buzzing quietly in the form of a message I hadn't yet sent. I didn't plan on seeing him, but I found myself dialing anyway. No voicemail, just a message. "I'm in town, 20 minutes?" He responded with nothing but the name of a street. We met near the edge of a frozen lake, where the woods thinned out into open sky. He was already there, leaning against a fence, coat buttoned to his throat. He didn't smile when he saw me, just nodded. We walked. No words for a long time. The snow crunched under our feet, our breaths curled into the air like invisible threads trying to knot themselves together. Eventually, I broke the silence. "He said he feels me slipping. Is he wrong?" "I don't know anymore." He stopped walking, turned toward me. "I don't want to be the thing you run to when you're lost," he said. "But I won't pretend I don't want you here." I stepped closer. "I'm tired," I said, "of pretending I know what I'm doing, of splitting myself in half every time I walk into a room." He nodded slowly. "So stop, even if it breaks everything." I didn't kiss him. He didn't kiss me. We stood there side by side, strangers and something more. And in that shared stillness, I realized the most terrifying part wasn't what I had done, it was what I was still willing to do. I returned to the cabin just before dark. The light had shifted into that low, golden hue that softens everything, even things that shouldn't be softened. The windows glowed from within like an old painting, still, warm, almost too gentle for the heaviness I carried inside. He was cooking. Again, something with rosemary and garlic, the scent trailing through the open door like an invitation. I stepped inside and didn't speak. Just hung my coat, pressed my hands against the cold of the wooden table, and let the silence gather. He turned from the stove and smiled, and something in my chest ached. Not from resentment, not from guilt, but from the sheer, unspoken weight of what I hadn't told him. We ate by candlelight that evening, though neither of us mentioned why. There was something ceremonial in the way we passed the bread, the way our fingers brushed across the wine glasses. He talked about work again. I nodded, asked questions, made observations about the stars when we stepped outside afterward, pretending. I hadn't noticed how my own voice sounded like an echo. That night in bed, he held me differently, with more intent, more stillness, as if he sensed this version of me might vanish if he gripped too tightly. His lips brushed my shoulder. My hand rested on his chest. I closed my eyes, tried to memorize the sound of his breathing, steady, certain, grounded. But the rhythm didn't settle me. It only reminded me how far I'd drifted from that steadiness. From him. I couldn't sleep. I slipped out of bed while he dreamed beside me and stepped onto the porch again, this time barefoot. The wood was cold beneath me, but I didn't flinch. The moon was swollen and low, casting everything in silver. I wrapped my arms around myself and looked out into the trees, as if they held answers. They didn't. I had stopped looking for answers, if I was honest. All I wanted now was a place to rest the truth. The next morning, the drive back felt longer. He talked less. Or maybe I just heard less. The city returned gradually, bleeding into the horizon in quiet layers. Telephone poles, blinking intersections, the same old billboards. My skin felt too tight. When we pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment after he'd gotten out, just breathing, just trying to feel like I still belonged to this version of my life. Inside, everything was the same. That was the cruelest part. The house held no memory of my betrayal. The pillows remained fluffed, the shoes lined up at the door, the scent of home unchanged. Only I knew that something essential had shifted out of alignment. Later that evening, after the unpacking, after the routine had reasserted itself, I found him in the living room with a small box in his hands, a square thing wrapped in matte paper with a thin silver ribbon. He handed it to me with a look I couldn't read. "I bought it before the trip," he said. "I was going to wait, but now feels right." Inside was a ring, not an engagement ring, not a grand gesture, just a thin band of brushed gold with a single word engraved on the inside. Still, I stared at it too long. "I know we've drifted," he said softly. "I don't know why, but I feel it, and I wanted you to know. I still choose you." The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't ask me to put it on. I didn't. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, facing away from him, the small box resting on the nightstand like a verdict. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I packed a bag with only what I needed for a few days: a change of clothes, a book, my journal, and the green silk slip I still couldn't throw away. I left. A note, not long, not dramatic, just words that I hoped would feel more honest than silence. I don't know who I am right now, and until I do, I can't keep pretending to be her. I didn't go to the bookstore. I didn't go to him. I drove. I passed the city limits, kept going, until the buildings thinned into fields, and the fields into trees. I found a roadside motel with a vacancy, and a room that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and worn fabric, and for the first time in months, I sat still. Not as a wife, not as a lover, just as a woman unraveling. I don't know what happens next. Maybe I'll call him. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll return to my husband. Or maybe I'll keep driving until the road stops giving me reasons to turn back. But for now, I am here. And in this moment, that is enough.